Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. On New Year's Eve, over 200 Indian citizens wrote an open letter to the President and the Prime Minister about the blood-curdling calls for genocide of Muslims and ethnic cleansing raised at a Dharam Sansad in Haridwar just about 10 days earlier. Signatories to that letter included several former service chiefs, several former senior ambassadors, and several former senior secretaries to the government of India. So today I want to start by asking, what were the concerns that motivated that letter? What response has it got? And how should we judge that response? My guest is one of the key signatories to the letter, the former Chief of the Navy Staff and former Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, Admiral Arun Prakash. Admiral Prakash, let's start with that letter written on the 31st of December and sent to the President and the Prime Minister. 8 days have passed. Has there been any response from the President or the Prime Minister?
None so far. And I think it's futile to expect one because past experience shows that such missives are rarely responded to and often not even acknowledged.
Has there been an acknowledgement in this case, even if not a reply?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, the letter was signed by 4 former naval chiefs, including yourself, a former Air Force chief, several senior former ambassadors who've represented the country, as well as several senior former secretaries to the government of India. Did you really expect it would be ignored, or are you a little disappointed and dismayed that that's happened?
Well, it was probably too much to expect a detailed response because it covered a lot of sensitive issues. But the least one expected was an acknowledgement that it has been seen by the addressee and it's being considered, how things are done in the government of India. But the least one expected was a acknowledgement that it has reached its addressees, but none has been forthcoming so far.
In fact, an acknowledgement would at least have been a courtesy. And even that courtesy has been denied to former chiefs, former ambassadors, former secretaries to the government of India.
That Mr. Thapar is par for the course.
That is very sad. Tell me in that case, Admiral Prakash, how do you interpret the fact that this letter has had no reply, no acknowledgement?
Let's leave the letter aside, but the developments of the last couple of weeks have been quite shocking and dismaying, and one feels a little despondent. Things have been said in public on electronic media openly, incitement to violence, threats to another community in India. The police has been totally inert. In the political establishment, no notice has been taken. So if you put all this together, then one wonders, does it signify tacit approval of what has been said? And then what happens once you start inciting people, and you are just one step away from somebody taking you seriously and acting on your incitement, advice, or whatever goes on. So all this put together is extremely disturbing because this was a call to genocide. It was a call to the armed forces and the police to take up arms and do A, B, or C. Such things are not to be accepted in a secular democracy.
You raised some very specific concerns in that letter. I'd like to touch on 1 or 2 of them. I'm going to quote from the letter. You wrote, "The unity and cohesiveness of our men in uniform will be seriously affected by allowing such blatant calls for violence against one or other community in our diverse and plural society." Clearly, you're talking about the fact that all 3 services have hundreds of thousands of Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Sikhs, in fact, people from all the religions present in India. What is your fear that these calls for violence will have on these men and the unity of the services?
So contemplate the Jawan who's sitting in Ladakh, sub-zero temperatures, guarding this country's frontiers. He hears this stuff or he reads it in the newspaper. People are threatening his community, whether he's a Muslim, Christian, or whatever. And his family is back home in the village. What is he supposed to think? I mean, he's sworn loyalty to the Constitution of India. And also, let's look back. I mean, did people like Somnath Sharma, the first Paramveer Chakra, people like Brigadier Usman, Havildar Abdul Hamid, Colonel Tarapur, did they shed blood for a religion, or did they fight for their motherland, for Bharat, for their country? Think of a person like General Cardozo. He lost his leg, he chopped his leg off with a kukri in Bangladesh. Did he do it for his religion or Hindutva? He did it for his country, for his motherland. And think of what goes on in Ian Cardozo's head when on Christmas Day he hears about his co-religionists being harassed and badgered, churches being desecrated, that kind of stuff. What goes on in the soldier's mind? I mean, a soldier swears allegiance to the country unto the peril of his life. No bureaucrat or anybody swears such an oath. We all swear that oath. Unto the peril of his life, to die for what? Not for some religion or sect, for his motherland. So let's not forget this. And by allowing such talk, allowing such incitement, you are sending a deep message of disquiet to the armed forces. And armed forces are the last bastion of this country which is holding it together. So I think we need to be mindful of this kind of thing. And clearly somebody in authority should say that this is nonsense. It is not the government's policy or the national thought process. Nobody said this.
One of the speakers at that Dharam Sansad in Haridwar actually made a call to the army and police to take up weapons and participate in the cleanliness drive. Cleanliness drive is nothing but a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. How ill-advised are such calls? What sort of impact would this have on Jawans who serve with each other, live as brothers, and are suddenly being told to take up arms against fellow soldiers?
All right, the armed forces, as I said, are the last bastion of this democracy, or whatever you call ourselves today. And they've been carefully nurtured over hundreds of years. The Indian Army is 350 years or more old. They've been carefully nurtured so that people from all faiths, all castes can fight together for the national cause. Now, as I said, you are sending very disturbing signals. You are likely to upset the cohesion and the unity of the armed forces. And once that happens, and people start thinking not in terms of their country, of their service, of their regiment, or platoon, or ship, once they start thinking on other lines, then you've lost a powerful weapon of the state. And I think our leadership should be thinking of the harm, the damage that is likely to be to occur to the Indian armed forces. They are really the last bastion of this country, which will stand firm against any threat. And one last point, Mr. Thapar, the enemies are in Ladakh. The enemies are on our western borders who are sending terrorists. The enemies are not inside the country. So if we start creating enemies or making enemies, figments of imagination, then you're just asking for trouble. You have your hands full on your external security front. Now you want to create another front inside the country. I think it's completely dumb and rational.
I want to pick up the point you're making, but first I just want to underline something you said for the audience, that these sort of calls could upset the unity and cohesion of our armed forces. That's a very important concern, and it's perfectly clear what you're saying. And I just hope people understand how dangerous that could be in a country like India. Really, this is a very...
I don't know whether people understand that on a ship, for example, you don't ask a person's religion. He may be manning a gun, a radar, a sonar. The whole ship goes into action. Now, if the thoughts in his mind are not about his ship or his commanding officer or his navy, and he's thinking of what's happening back home, how do you rate the effectiveness, fighting efficiency of a unit like that? And it's even worse in the army. There is one regiment, not in a battalion. You may have people from 3 or 4 different religions. The commanding officer is supposed to observe the religious ceremonies of his troops. That's the tradition of the army. Now you're creating doubts in the minds of people who've been brought up from day one, from their day of taking the oath of allegiance. Now you're casting doubts in their mind about issues which we never crossed our minds. Religion never crossed the mind of a service person.
But Admiral Prakash, these calls for genocide and cleansing won't just have an impact on the services. which is what we've been discussing, they will also have an impact on the peace and harmony of our country. And does that second impact raise in your mind worrying concerns of national security? In a sense, you were talking about it a moment ago.
Yes, so why that's why one wonders that when the country is facing huge problems, there's a triple crisis on our hand. We have a pandemic, which we may not be able to cope with. We have a economic crisis, a downturn, and we have two enemies on our borders. And this is the last thing on our mind should be, issues of religion and caste and creed. This is the time for the leadership to bind the country together, sink your differences, and pose a common front against the threats that are facing us. One can see that we are still groping for answers to all three crises. We haven't got the answers. Now, what sense or logic does it make to go and seek another crisis, another issue, create it within your own country? And this silence is ominous and makes no sense. There should be outright condemnation. There should be firm action against such talk, such nonsense, divisive issues being brought up. And there is bound to be a counter. I mean, if you threaten somebody often enough and so blatantly, there is bound to be a counter to it. And then the next step is a conflict.
That could lead to civil war.
Yes, indeed. Is that what we want?
In a sense, you wrote about this in an article you wrote for the Deccan Herald shortly after that Dharam Sansad issued these blood-curdling calls. You said, already India faces the threat of a 2.5 front war. And then you very carefully wrote, if you now superimpose religious, sectarian fratricide, the cumulative threat could overwhelm India's security apparatus and bring us to the brink of disaster. The silence, the attitude that as if nothing has happened, is actually pushing the country to the brink of disaster.
Well, I mean, if you overlook all the propaganda which is put out, etc., if we take a realistic look at our national security, which we haven't done for many years, if we ever did a defense review or pushed out a white paper, we would know exactly where we stand vis-a-vis our adversaries. And we've got two of them, both nuclear armed. And of course, China is technologically, economically far ahead of us. So if we take a realistic view of it, the best we can do is hold off the threat. If it comes to a conflict, then I shudder to think the consequences. Now, this is the situation. The best we can do is to hold off the threat diplomatically and militarily, which we are doing quite well. Our armed forces are standing. Now, on top of this delicate situation, if you create internally a situation where there is conflict, sectarian conflict, or a civil war, as you put it, I hope it doesn't come to that. But if anything happens inside the country, it will distract the attention of your security forces, your police, your PMFs, your armed forces. Is that what you want? Is that any right-thinking leader who looks at the country's national security? Is that what he wants? Well, let him ask I'm retired, sitting at home. Ask the generals, the serving generals, the admirals, the air marshals, how well off we are, how capable we are of defending ourselves externally. I'm sure we are quite well off there. But now you ask for, and you already have trouble in Kashmir, you have trouble in the Northeast, those Naxalites are still rampaging. So with all these on your hand, do you want to open yet another front where two communities are at each other's throats? Is that what you want? Is that what common sense tells you?
You wrote in very powerful personal terms in that Deccan Herald article, and it actually took me aback when I read it. I want to quote it. You said, "Rarely have I felt such a deep sense of dismay and apprehension as I do today. It's given rise to a foreboding about the future of my country." You really are worried about India's future.
Yes, I am. If people are given the freedom to incite violence, to propose genocide, and nobody does anything about it, I would have expected that those people should be taken to task, put behind bars, as a justice said on your channel a day ago. But not only has the police been totally inert, that means the rule of law has been suspended. You can say anything, you can incite violence, you can invite genocide and get away with it. So the police is not all right. Again, that is more or less accepted. But the leadership of the country, who care for this country, who care for the safety, the national security, there's total silence from them. Some of them say it is a fringe. If it is a fringe, then put them behind bars. If they are not the fringe, then advise. I mean, one of the duties of the leadership, of a national leadership, is to guide the misguided elements in the country. I mean, people may have all sorts of wild thoughts, but it's the duty of the leadership to put them on the right track. The track is that we should focus on national security, we should focus on development, we should focus on poverty alleviation, get medical assistance to those in need. Do we need such distractions which have no relevance whatsoever to our national welfare and well-being?
I want to ask you two more questions before I change subjects. Do you feel that our leadership is letting us down by its silence at this moment? Because let's be honest, there's been total silence for 3 weeks from the Prime Minister and his government in Delhi, from the Chief Minister in Uttarakhand and his government in Dehradun. And worse still, although the police have filed FIRs, 20 days have gone by and not a single person has been arrested, which means those who called for genocide are still free and walking.
I don't want to comment about the leadership, but by definition, leadership is to guide your people, the people whom you lead. And this is a nation of 130 crore people of different faiths, castes, creeds, etc. It's the duty of the leadership to lead us on the right path. And the right path should lead us to welfare of the country, its security, its development, and so on. So that's the duty of the leadership. Now it's up to the leadership to see what they want to do. And if elections are placed before national interest, then I'm afraid there's some rethinking to be done. If
So
vote gathering, elections take precedence over national security and national well-being, I think there is some serious rethinking that needs to be done.
So the leadership is not fulfilling its duty.
Those are your words.
But do you disagree?
No, I don't.
One other thing. That letter was signed, as I said, by 4 former naval chiefs, a former Air Force chief. But not a single former army chief signed the letter. And I believe they were all approached and asked. And the army is by far the biggest service in the country, by far. Would you have liked 1 or 2 former army chiefs to have also signed the letter?
I'm not the originator of that letter, Mr. Thapar. I'm just a signatory, so I don't know the background. Well, there can be 2 reasons. One is that either people agree with what's happening and don't agree with the text of the letter. That's one possibility. It's dreadful to contemplate. There is that possibility. The other is that they do feel that they should have said something, but are too apprehensive of the consequences that could result from it. In either case, it's something to worry about.
Definitely. It's particularly worrisome if a former army chief is apprehensive of the consequences and out of, forgive me, fear cannot sign a letter. And it's even worse if a former army chief actually agrees with the calls for genocide and therefore chooses not to sign the letter. Either of those would be deeply disillusioning for veteran soldiers, for serving soldiers, and for the country as a whole.
I don't want to speculate any further on this topic, Mr. Thapar.
Okay, let me come to the other issue I want to raise with you today. It's an issue that you've written about several times in articles that you've written for various Indian papers. And in a sense, you were talking about it now as well. The challenge, if not the threat, that India faces from China. Most people are well aware after the last 22 months of the challenge on the northern borders in Ladakh all the way across to Arunachal Pradesh. But you've also written about what you call Beijing's maritime rise. Could you explain that challenge further?
Yes, the Chinese leadership at the turn of the century realized that in order to realize China's dream, the great China dream of becoming a superpower by 2050, it is vital for China, which was so far considered itself a continental country, to become a maritime power. So they took a decision which startled observers. In fact, many of them were skeptical the statement said that China must become a maritime great power. Now, this phrase has a lot of connotations. And with great resolve and tremendous vision, they have set about it. And in a very short period of 15 odd years, they have actually become a maritime great power. And maritime power has many components to it. You must have a shipbuilding industry. You must have a large shipping at your disposal. Your capability to explore the seabed must be there. A fishing fleet. China has the biggest fishing fleet in the world, biggest coast guard. So they have resolutely attained every element of great maritime power, and today they can dominate the seas. And every country, including India, depends on the seas. So whoever dominates the seas then can dominate people, around them. So that's the next of the story. I mean, that's the crux of the story. Sorry.
Now, one of your concerns, which in a sense is connected to this, and it's again something you hinted at a moment ago, and I'm quoting you, no Indian government since independence has deemed it necessary to issue a defense white paper, order a defense review, or publish a national security strategy. And in that particular article, you call this a measure of our complacency and indifference towards national security. Who's responsible or carries the can for this? Is it politicians? Is it the serving chiefs and the heads of the three services who should be putting pressure on them? Or is it just the national attitude that everything will carry on okay?
Perhaps it's a mixture of all three, but it is the responsibility of the national leadership to define what the country wants in the next 15, 20, 50 years. And depending on that, the armed forces, the bureaucracy, the diplomats can help the government to define a vision and put it down in black and white. Every country of consequence does that. They produce a national security strategy. China does it every 2 years. Its unclassified version is full of details of what they want, where they are going, how they will do it, how they will finance it, what will be the size of the armed forces. Why we haven't done? One of the reasons is that once you put things down on paper, then you're committed to it. You can make very bold statements that, we'll give the Chinese a bloody nose and we'll do this, that, and the other. But you must be quite sure that you have the means to do it. Have you given the wherewithal to your armed forces to give a bloody nose to the Chinese? So those answers will have to be given. So it is convenient for the political establishment not to create or put down in black and white a national security strategy. And that's what's happened. They've just been kicking the can down the road, and the armed forces don't know which way are headed. Funding is always inadequate. Every crisis sends the defense minister out on a shopping spree. In Galwan 2020, the first thing that happened was Raksha Mantri landed up in Moscow asking for fighters. That's not how you plan national security. National security needs to be visualized and planned for 20, 30 years ahead.
Now, you make one more very powerful point specifically with relation to China. You say, and I'm quoting you, our diplomats have failed for decades to negotiate ad hoc boundaries into stable, mutually agreed upon international borders. What you're saying there is that the land problem, the border problem with China should have been settled decades ago, and the failure to do that is a failure of Indian diplomacy.
Yes, if you look at history, wars are fought for certain reasons. And after the war is over, after the conflict is concluded, the parties sit down around a table and look at what was the casus belli, what led to the war. Most of the time, it is a territorial dispute. The first thing you do after post-bellum is to try and eliminate the casus belli. We fought wars, and we've not even thought of settling the cause of the war. In 1962, we went to war over border dispute. So the diplomats of this country, the statesmen of this country, wherever they are, the first thing they should have done was to sit down and sort out the border. Same with Pakistan. We fought wars with them. The casus belli has remained there. So I think that the diplomats have just hoped against hope, kicked the can down the road, made conciliatory noises and hope that things will improve. They haven't. So that's where the blame should rest on our statesmen and on our diplomats who failed to create. It doesn't matter how much territory, 1 mile or 2 miles this side or that side. We need to have stable international borders. Only then can we proceed with the process of development and so on inside the country. If we keep getting distracted every few years by some border violation or incursion, we will never be at peace.
In fact, you make one further very powerful point, both about Indian diplomacy as well as India's strategic handling of its neighborhood. Again, I'm going to quote you. You write, India has rarely been able to dissuade any neighbor, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and even tiny Maldives, from undertaking actions inimical to Indian interests. The loss of all friends in our close neighborhood should weigh heavily on the minds of our statesmen and our diplomats. That is actually a stinging indictment of our political leaders and our diplomats, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. It's a huge contradiction. On one hand, we seek global status. We want to be a great power. But if we can't sort out our close neighborhood, then I mean, where's the question of reaching out to to the rest of the world? And those are I think, basic tenets of diplomacy, that you must make friends with your neighbors. So you start clockwise from Nepal to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to Maldives. At some point of time or the other, we offended. So who do we have to represent ourselves? It's our diplomats. And who tell the diplomats what to do? It's our statesmen. So obviously there is a flaw somewhere, that we are unable to make friends of our immediate neighborhood. And that is one of the greatest causes of our insecurity. Here's a country, Bangladesh, whom we were instrumental or we helped create. Today, I mean, if you call them termites and you keep throwing accusations at them that they're infiltrating and so on, you expect them to be friends? Similarly, I'm sure we are in some way or the other giving offense or patronizing or being condescending to our smaller neighbors, which causes a resentment. Tiny Maldives, there's a movement on their India out or something. So I think there's cause for reflection in the MEA and higher up as to, are we doing the things the right way?
My last question, Admiral Prakash, and in a sense, it ties up all that we're talking about, and it also reflects the way our government approaches critical national security issues. It's exactly 1 month to the day since the tragic death of General Rawat, but we haven't as yet appointed a new Chief of Defence Staff. Are you surprised at the delay, and is the delay a matter of concern?
Of course it is. Succession in a military organization is not a matter of speculation, should not be. It's all clear-cut, the lines are clear-cut. And if some decision has to be taken, it should not take more than a day or 2 or 3 or a week at the most for the cabinet committee to meet and decide who should be the Chief of Defence Staff. But you have to get your priorities right. If national security is something that will take care of itself and elections take priority, then this sort of thing will happen. I mean, there are elections in any given month. There is an election somewhere or the other. You have to decide your priorities. Elections are to be won, of course, but at what price are they to be won? Is the whole apparatus of the government of India, all our elected representatives, to focus themselves exclusively on winning state elections, or are there any other issues that need to be addressed? The question is open.
So is it irresponsible not to have appointed a Chief of Defence Staff for a whole month?
It is entirely undesirable, not good for anybody, and it sends a signal to your adversaries how serious you are about your national security. And don't forget that the CDS is in the chain of the nuclear deterrent also. So here's a key component which is missing.
So the absence of a CDS is a matter of grave concern to the country.
Yes, it is.
Admiral Prakash, thank you very much for this interview. And in particular, thank you very much for agreeing to speak openly about those dreadful blood-curdling calls for genocide and express your concern. Your words were, "The silence is ominous. There should be outright condemnation." Unfortunately, all we hear is silence, and that condemnation is not happening. Leave aside in an outright way, it's not even happening sotto voce. Thank you very much for this interview. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.